Hi, everyone. I hope you're ready for a great day. I'm going to kick off our first panel for the day. I am so excited to introduce our panelist. We have Bryce Covert. She is a journalist and who is also an op-ed writer for the New York Times and The Nation, has written for many, many respectable publications. And she's the former editor of the Roosevelt Institute's Next New Deal blog. Thank you so much, Bryce, for joining us.
Glad to be here.
And we also have, is Julie on? Yes,
Hi,
Julie, how are you?
good, thanks.
Julie is a senior fellow and director for women's economic justice at the Century Foundation. Her policy work and expertise is in work family, caregiving, economic mobility, and labor issues. And we'll be joined in a few minutes by our third panelist, Jennifer Jones Austin, who is the CEO of FPWA, which is a major influential anti-poverty policy and advocacy organization. So I would love to start off by asking the two of you, I mean, clearly, COVID has shown us this past year, exposed the deep structural flaws in our economy and how childcare is so vital to our economy and to families, and particularly mothers being able to function. What will it take in a post-COVID world to make finally changes on these issues?
Go ahead, Bryce.
Okay.
Start us off.
Either of us could join in on that.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for having me on this panel. It's really exciting to be part of this conference today. We all probably know that childcare was in crisis long before the pandemic ever hit. I've been covering childcare for about a decade, and to say we have a system is sort of false. It's a patchwork, privatized system where parents are struggling to afford care, and the providers themselves are often scraping by on poverty wages. I've talked to many providers who say they operate in the red. Usually they barely make a profit. That's for parents, of course, also who can afford and find childcare. In a lot of places in this country, there isn't even an option for them, even if they can't afford it. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and childcare providers have been hit really, really hard. A lot of them shut down in the beginning out of health concerns or out of an inability to stay afloat. A lot of them were struggling to figure out how to keep everything safe for the children and for the parents, and also for themselves and their staff. I think some providers have tried to open back up as in some places cases got lower and restrictions got eased. But as cases are climbing, they're back in the same position they were in before. And as you pointed out, Sonia, they've gotten very little support. There has been some federal funding, but it's been such a tiny fraction of the need. They have not gotten anything since that first CARES Act infusion. And at the same time, we're now seeing what this means for parents. When you take away childcare, and also when you take away in-person school, you throw the entire economy into chaos. And I think we are living through an extremely clear example of why childcare is an economic issue and is infrastructure that undergirds our entire economy.
And I'll just add, because I think Bryce and I tend to agree a lot on these issues, and I think that was incredibly well said. And that what I think we need to make the changes there's sort of two different tracks, right? There's one that is recognizing the ways in which our policy choices about childcare are rooted in institutionalized sexism, and that basically childcare has always been, unpaid labor of moms or underpaid labor of a disproportionately women of color workforce, of Black, Latinx, immigrant women. with its history in chattel slavery and what enslaved women were doing. And so we kind of have this starting place where since World War II, our government has not invested in childcare, and it was a policy choice that, it actually holds women back. It holds women from gaining resources, from gaining power. And so I think we need to surface that even more to say that if we could invest in childcare and make it something that is a well-paid profession, and honor the value of that care, that actually would make a significant difference in combating discrimination against women and combating the unequal pay that we face, and supporting women gaining resources and power. And so the lack of it holds us back, but doing it could make a big difference. Then at the same time, as Bryce said, I think we need to make the case that it is actually essential to economic recovery, that we cannot have a half a recovery with only men. Like, that's not okay. And I did a report recently with Sarah Jane Glynn and Amanda Novello showing that we're at risk of losing about $65 billion in aggregate women's wages, and from mothers either stepping back, leaving their jobs entirely, or reducing their hours. That is a huge hit to the economy. That is, at a minimum, about $12 billion in lost tax revenue as well. And it has repercussions. It has ripple effects for communities. It has ripple effects for women's future economic security, for their families. And so I think recognizing, this is, of course, a central women's issue, and also, like, the economy cannot function without it.
What are your thoughts on the Biden administration and what we can expect from them so far? And what do you think it will take to move that needle?
Want me to start, Bryce?
Sure, go for it.
I think this is this future administration is taking this issue incredibly seriously. Biden Harris put out the Build Back Better plan, saying that care infrastructure is central to economic relief and recovery. They put together a plan that calls for the Childcare for Working Families Act, which invests in both the affordability side and the workforce. And it's a really comprehensive bill that would make a huge difference. He calls for universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, as well as looking at the long-term services and support side of things, which of course also falls disproportionately on women, where women are taking care of their aging parents or their other loved ones with a disability. And so I think that we are well set up with this future administration to prioritize this. At the same time, I think they need to hear from us, right? There's a lot of competing priorities. We're going to be talking about climate change. We're going to be talking about COVID recovery, as we should be. We're going to be talking about climate change, as we should be. We're going to be talking about racial justice, and this is, of course, a racial justice issue. And they're going to be tackling the recession, right? And making sure that it's understood that childcare is key to all of these things is the job of advocates. And so I think that's our job.
Yeah. I want to ask you about, at the state level, what you think that we can expect and what has been done and what needs to be done. But Bryce, before we leave talking about the federal efforts, you had talked to interesting and saying, we don't have to look to Europe to see that this can be done. Can you talk a little bit about that, the history of childcare here in the United States?
Absolutely. I think on these issues, we tend to say, oh, look at Scandinavia or look at other European countries. And certainly they are doing a much better job than we are on funding a real childcare infrastructure. But we have examples here at home. Julie mentioned before World War II. I think people may not be familiar with the fact that during World War II, this country actually had a nationwide universal childcare program. It was care that was heavily subsidized. It cost very little for parents. It was very high quality. The mothers who put their kids in it loved it. They gave it rave reviews. And economists have looked at the impacts of it on children later in life and found extraordinary improvements in education, in employment, in wages. So it was extremely successful. It unfortunately ended as a war ended, but we nearly did the same exact thing in the 70s. the country, Congress, both houses of Congress passed on a bipartisan, in a bipartisan way, a universal child care program. Everyone expected President Nixon to sign it, and then he did sort of an about face abruptly and issued a very scathing veto. But it was at that time a bipartisan agreement that we needed to invest in the early years of childcare. And you can see that in states and in cities across the country. There are places like in New York, we have universal preschool, but places like Oklahoma have universal preschool. This is not necessarily something that falls on a Democrat Republican binary. And we see other really exciting things. I think Washington, D.C. is really doing interesting work trying to invest not only in universal preschool, but now down through the 0 to 3 ages, trying to really make it a comprehensive system. So yes, we can look abroad, but we very much can also look here at home.
Thank you so much.
I'm happy to talk about New York, but I just have to share, this is my favorite quote from that time in World War II. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote, a few of us had an inkling that perhaps these childcare centers and childcare programs was a need that was constantly with us, but one that had been neglected in the past. And she wanted to keep them open, but she did not win that fight. And, again, also to Bryce's point about the bipartisanship of it, we actually had the largest historic increase in childcare funding in 2018. So, while we are, have been fighting so many negative things during this time, this was actually a win where, the voices of grassroots advocates were heard, where there were leaders like Senator Warren and Senator Sanders who were standing up and saying that this is a need, and it passed on a bipartisan basis, and the Trump administration actually signed it. So it really can be bipartisan. Here in New York, I've definitely heard talk of a universal childcare or a comprehensive childcare for all proposal, and really trying to push to put those kinds of things in place. I think it's challenging in the current fiscal climate that, with states are struggling and they don't have the revenue that they need to do what's needed. And the reality is you cannot do childcare right without a lot of money. Like right now, that money is being spent by the parents. It's being spent by, the lack of good wages for childcare providers. It's like we're, paying too low and we're paying too much. And it just costs a lot to do it well, right? And so we need government funding for it. So I think what we need to do now is start to set up the structures for that, is to keep pushing for those federal dollars to come in and get the state ready to do really good reforms that make it much more accessible for everybody, that it's not just a low income issue. While we do want to make sure that families who are struggling the most get the most help, this is something that most families in America are facing and struggling with right now. And so we really need government to step in. It's really should be it is a public good, and it should be treated that way in New York and nationally.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That is so key. And looking at the realities of budgets now in this economy it's really difficult to try and figure out how to deal with that. Clearly, we have to continue to keep these issues on the front burner, find the policies that are going to be most effective, so that we can be ready and we continue to push for them. Even here in New York, home healthcare workers who are mostly Black and brown women, we've been working on this front for several years, trying to make sure that they're paid even minimum wage, and they have these mandatory 24-hour work days. And these are dollars that come out of the Medicaid budgets. And the money just isn't there now. So it is difficult to try and figure out how to really demand that when the money is not there. And when we have Jennifer on the line, one of the things that her organization has done is created, it's on the federal level, but a federal budget tracking system to see where money goes. It's kind of the discussion that we are having about defunding the police. It's really more an issue of let's keep an eye on budgets and where is the money spent, because where you spend the money is where your priorities are. I would love to ask the both of you to talk a little bit about framing these issues, because clearly that hasn't happened well enough in decades. But now it is. I mean, it's not, as you were saying, it's not a blue or red issue. It's not a suburban rural issue. This affects all families, and it's interconnected with the economy. And we haven't talked yet about women's value in the workforce and how to raise wages. But how can we change that conversation to talk about this in ways that aren't bipartisan, that aren't back burner issues or women's issues? And if you have any examples of other issues where that has been effective to change, the changing of the message.
Julie, do you want to start? Do you want me to start?
I will say, I think that we need to keep tying it to economic growth and economic recovery. And I find this a little bit infuriating, right? Because I feel like it should be enough that this is keeping women out of the workforce, right? Like it should be enough for us to act that women are, running marathons while juggling fire right now. Like that should be enough for Congress to have to act and do something about this. And, we know that the way to get things done in the current climate is to talk about things as an economic recovery issue and because they are, right? We have the benefit of the fact that that's true. It's a healthcare issue. It's tied to so many different issues. It's a racial justice issue. And so, how do we, I think, frame it in those ways? I think there's more work to be done to think about, how do we create urgency around this? That when you ask people whether they're supportive of childcare for all, most of them say yes. However, if you ask them what are their top priorities, a lot of them will say jobs and healthcare or, other issues. And so, how do we bring this to the top of the list? So I'm gonna see if Bryce has answers for that.
Well, to be honest, I actually, one of the very few things I feel optimistic about in this pandemic is that I think that that's the way the conversation is evolving. The crisis is so acute right now, and it is so clear, and it's impacting so many people that I think you cannot avoid the recognition that childcare is essential to the economy. We have a record number of women out of the workforce right now because their children are not in either daycare or in-person schooling. It's historic. And if we want to recover, we have to bring them back in. I was talking to an economist for an article I was writing about this, and she said, look, yes, there may be stigma against women who leave the workforce to care for children, but if employers decide to do that to all these women right now who are out of the workforce, the economy will never recover. We need them to come back. We need them to get back into the productive jobs that they have invested in, that they have trained for, educated for, if we want to get back to where we were in February. So there's a national urgency, I think, around this that I wish we had had more of that urgency before the pandemic, but my hope is that we'll keep it going even once we start to get on the other side.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, I would welcome.
Thank you.
The organization that you run, FPWA, does such fantastic work on all the issues that we're talking about. Right now, Black and brown women's unemployment rate has hit 9.2%. That is compared to white men, which is 5.8%. Can you talk a little bit about what it's going to take to create more opportunity and better job pipelines for all women, but particularly this situation, the economy that we're in, COVID, is really disproportionately affecting Black and brown women?
Indeed, indeed it is. And let me just quickly say that I'm glad to be with you all. Sorry that I am late to the party. I was actually in another conversation, but it seems like I've joined right at the right time. So thanks for having me and for being understanding. The unemployment rate for Black and Brown Americans has long been disproportionately higher, and especially for Black women. What I think we need to center on at this moment is that the business community is in some ways kind of understanding this and picking this up. Here in New York City, the business community, led by the New York City Partnership, sent a letter to the mayor of New York about 6 weeks ago or so saying, we got to get the essential workers back to work. The essential workers, not the healthcare workers per se, but the Black and brown persons working, and women mainly, working in the bodegas, the grocery stores, the delis in the Wall Street area and around Rockefeller Center, the childcare workers, the nannies. We got to get them back to work because it's messing us up. I think what we need to do and to understand and appreciate is some may know, some may not know that the Black female segment of the population is actually on average the most educated segment of our American population. We're also the least paid on average. A Black woman with a master's degree has to, work several more weeks in the year to earn what a white man with an associate's degree earns. It's insane. So a lot of it centers on pay and gender equity, but it also has to start with this understanding, valuing the work of women and women who are often working in these low wage positions. We don't value childcare in America. We don't value home health attendants. We don't value domestic workers, right? We see them as kind of ancillary. They don't really make a difference. But in COVID, we're seeing, oh, yes, they really do. Because the woman who, the DA who I saw in the chat a few weeks ago, who was trying to have a conversation about police brutality and police misconduct, and there were kids running around behind her, she needed somebody back in her home to help her. But we don't value that work. So for me, a lot of it centers on legislation, because people aren't going to do it themselves. Corporate America wants us back, but not necessarily at fair pay. Right? They want us back, but we need to center on law, legislation. One of the things that we're doing in our organization, we've been doing it now for about 3 or 4 years, following paid family leave, achieving the passage of that. We began looking at the wages of low-income people and trying to get a sense of who they are in New York City. And what we found was, even in the nonprofit sector that is here to support people who are struggling, the nonprofit sector funded by the city of New York was paying women, you ready for this? 40% of the workforce was being paid less than $12 an hour. 25% was being paid less than $9 an hour. And in the main, these were Black and brown women trying to provide support for people struggling, and they themselves were eligible for income supports. So what we did was we pushed the city of New York. And we said, Mayor de Blasio, you're out here, championing a higher wage, but you're actually overseeing contracts for nonprofit work in organizations paying women less than $12 and $9 an hour, Black and brown women. Well, can I tell you that the nonprofit sector, sadly, was like, stop this, Jennifer. We want the money, but we need to decide where it's going. We had to fight not only government, but we had to fight the sector. Ultimately, we secured a prevailing living wage, a bottom line of $15 for about 50,000 Black and brown women, and then a few more here in New York City. We then started doing the work of looking at legislation and requiring that any policy and legislation at the city level, I'm trying to do the same thing at the state level now, be filtered through a race and gender equity frame. So when you're talking about paid family leave and making changes to it, when you're talking about telecommuting policies, right, and making changes there, when you're talking about what pay should actually look at, let's look at it through a Black and brown women frame as you know, like, because what's happening is we're forgetting that Black and brown women are often the primary breadwinners because of all of these other attendant race-based, systemic race-based issues. And so the Black woman's experience, you know, she's like, you know, 80% of the time carrying the family and all these expenses attendant to that. So doing that type of work. And the last thing I'll quickly say is we're also leaning into the question of what is the role of the union, especially in cities like New York, where you have so many people working government jobs, or they're working in nonprofits under contract with the city of New York, but they don't have wage protection at the levels that they should. We found that childcare workers in nonprofit organizations providing UPK services were making $20,000, $22,000. The workers in the Department of Education, the city's Department of Education, doing the very same job and actually working 10 months as opposed to the 12 months being worked by the women in the nonprofits, they were making upwards of 50, 60, some of them $70,000. And everybody was okay with that. So we partnered with one of the largest unions and got up under their wing, and they helped us to champion the cause of childcare workers at nonprofit organizations. So what I think it requires is legislation, law, you know, being at times, you know, engaged in the war of position and at other times the war of maneuver. So sometimes operating from within and sometimes agitating on the outside, but it's got to be more than just policy or executive order.
Absolutely. You know, we've now New York worked with the school safety agents, city jobs, and this is a category where they actually have more training than the other same positions in that category of safety agents. City-run hospitals, the morgue, for instance, a lot more happening at schools than at morgues. And the school safety agents are 75% female, and they made $7,000 a year less than the other categories, which were male dominated. So for organizations like ours, you know, we're able to get in at more the local and state levels and identify these issues and stand with them and advocate with and for them. And those school safety agents, we actually negotiated as well that those who had retired got extra dollars in their bank account, which was incredibly satisfying. We don't have a lot of time yet left. I feel like we could continue this conversation for another hour, but I would love to ask each of you for your observations and the work that you have done working with constituencies on the ground and creating policy and seeing how it is changed. What can we as individuals, we've all been out there working hard, pushing forward a new administration federally. Obviously, what happens at the state and local level is just as important, and that's where we're centered at Now New York and our chapters. What can we as voters and local activists and chapters do to identify these problems and to push progress forward and opportunity and equality?
I'll begin. I came late and now I'm just taking, right, and jumping in and taking over. So a few thoughts on that. The first is one that sometimes people say, oh, do we really need to do this? I think we need to be having these types of conversations as much as we possibly can. We got into a space and a place in terms of movement building and organizing and getting engaged, where we minimized the value of conversation and shared understanding of the problems. Very often we jump to the policy making or the law making, and we think that everybody understands what's really going on. I think in this moment, if you just take, for example, policing in America, everybody's focused on systemic racism in policing, but we're not talking about how systemic racism pervades every pillar of our society. Education, housing, environmental justice, criminal justice, right? Health and mental health, and how that is especially challenging for women because our society is founded in misogyny. So we need to be having these conversations like you're doing here. And then what I think we also need to be doing then is helping people to understand it is important to lend your support to the organizations that are on the ground, that on a daily basis are providing direct services and supports to women who are in need. But it is as important, if not more important in this moment, to volunteer and support organizations like NOW that are doing the structural work. In America, 1.8% of community foundations funding goes to Black and Brown communities, just 1.8%. And of that 1.8%, only 3% goes to organizations engaged in structural change. What does that tell you? Those in charge, those with power, want to keep the status quo. They want you to believe that they're concerned and they're engaged. But people need to begin to see how the policy and the legal work is in many ways more important than the direct service hand, because what you're doing is the old Chinese proverb: feed a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. And so what I say is, let's keep educating, and then let's help people to understand that the work of NOW is so critically important because you're doing the systems work, the policy and legislation work that will bring about the change.
Thank you so, so much. I think that is a great place to end, and we are on time. Perhaps we can still ask any questions in the chats if you have for all of our panelists. And I'd love to just end with a comment from one of our participants today. And she says, as an early childhood educator, I cannot express how much I appreciate these issues being addressed